And so in this first panel, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about and have you hear the history of who these founders and framers are whose names you don't know. But first, I wanted to share with you this image. When I think about the country that I want, the new vision of our country, I think about Aisha Evans, a nurse who confronted in a thin sundress, right, heavily armed police officers during 2020. And I think this might have even been 2019. And, you know, in later interviews, she said she didn't even think about it. She just knew she had to stop them. And this picture is so remarkable because you can see that they are stopped. Look at their legs. They're like stopped in mid. And her power, her moral force, stops them. And to me, that is the image of an American citizen. Someone who is prepared to stand, to use their moral force and power. They don't have to have any particular degree, any particular outfit, have any particular office, that they have the right as an ordinary American citizen to push back against what is wrong and to stand for what is right. So that's my vision of our future. Our first panel is made up of some extraordinary people, 3 historians and 2 incredible activists who are going to help us think about how we can be founders and framers. So I'm going to ask them to just join me. We are joined by Gabrielle Foreman, who is the founder or co-founder of Colored Conventions. She's a professor at Penn State University. Martha Jones, who is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History, Professor at the SNF Agora Institute and Director of Graduate Studies at Johns Hopkins. Kate Masur, who's a Professor of History at Northwestern University. And then Latosha Brown, who many of you know, who is a voting rights activist and co-founder of Black Voters Matter, and Reverend William Lamar IV, who keeps telling me to call him Bill, but I was raised in the AME church and I'm an AME, so I have to call him Reverend Lamar, who is the pastor of Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C. Their bios are in your programs, and the bios are pages long, and you should take your time, sit back tonight with a cup of coffee, and understand the people that we have brought to this institution today. But I want you to join me in welcoming this extraordinary panel.
Can we say thank you and acknowledge the lesson, the lifting, the vision, the prophecy of Professor Sherilyn Ifill? I want to thank Dean Fairfax, the organizers of this symposium, the audience, fellow panelists, for having us here today to learn together, to be inspired together, to recommit to the vision of justice, of equality that is so important to our personal understanding of ourselves, to our collective understanding of this country. This morning, thank you again, Professor Ifill. We're so glad to be here together. Though all of us are familiar, at least now we are, of the civil rights amendments that were the refounding of American democracy and the American Constitution, very few know, beyond the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement, about the 38 years of Black activism that led to not only the freedom of 4 million slaves at the end of the war, but to the commitment to equality that they organized for, beginning in the AME Church in Mother Bethel in 1830 and going on in colored conventions, multi-day meetings across the nation and in states over 7 decades. This is the prequel to the NAACP. It is a movement that not only decides that African Americans deserve to be free, but also that we deserve freedom and absolute access to education. It organizes for labor rights, for jury rights, for political rights. It brings Black people together as leaders in multi-day conventions that met in states in January of all times, in places like Iowa and Illinois. And I thought when I saw these meetings in January in 1830 and 35 and Philadelphia and then across the country, why are they meeting then? And they are meeting then because they meet right before the actual state legislature meets. They position themselves politically through delegates who are coming from all over the states and then all over the nation to organize also against anti-Black violence, which was the precipitator of the first convention held in 1830 in Mother Bethel in the last year of Reverend Bishop Allen's life. These conventions precede the organizing of the antebellum movement for abolition. They start in 1830, 2 and 3 years before the New England Anti-Slavery Society is founded, before the American Anti-Slavery Society is founded. They are the instigators, in many cases, of Black newspapers, of Black networks. And in addition to that, they are creating a parallel politics, organizing for rights at a moment where we are disenfranchised, including free Blacks, from voting in all but 5 states across the nation. This precursor to the NAACP is creating its own records. It is assessing Black wealth, Black institution building. It is pushing back against the organizing structures which continue to insist upon our diminishment. Mental illness overrepresented in national censuses, for example, run by the government, and instead are creating and preserving records of our own wealth and health and institution building and networks on our own, and insisting that there are other institutions like Black newspapers, not anti-slavery newspapers, Black-run newspapers, not just about freedom, but about equality. Let's go on to that next slide. We once only knew about 12 national conventions held in one small, slim book by Howard Holman Bell that actually could run for $3,500. I know this because one of my students lost one of my colleagues' book and we had to replace it. Took us 2 years to get one for $300. And 45 state conventions. When the Colored Conventions Project, which I am a co-founder of with many other people who do this work together, when we came together, we decided to work collectively in the same manner, a distributed manner across states with many partners like Kate Masur, and there are now 250 conventions on our site, but we've recovered 600. And those are being processed and put up now, and they tell this story. You see that photo there? That's folks in 76 in Tennessee voting on resolves, on principles, organizing together. Let's go to the next. And it included people like John Mercer Langston. Folks here know his name. Who's the inaugural dean of where? Howard Law School, right? And an acting president of Howard Law School. With his brother, he went to over 35 conventions. When we talk about Douglass, who went from conventions before his narrative was published in 45. His first convention is in 43. He is in his early 20s. He went to conventions in 40 years. Now, we have how many biographies who tell his story through the records and the networks of white abolitionists, through the stories of Lincoln, through the stories of William Lloyd Garrison, but he is in convention with black leaders for 40 years. And I will read some of his words as I close out today. His brother, Charles, whose signature is at the bottom here, and I should say he goes on from Howard to become elected to the Virginia, as the representative to the U.S. Congress from Virginia, where they contest seating him, right? And also a university president. His brother Charles's signature is on the bottom, and if we go to the next slide, we can read what the Kansas State Convention says in '66. As the 14th Amendment has been passed at the Senate, is moving on to the House of Representatives, and then will take 2 years to be ratified. He says, resolved, that we hold as enemies of humanity all persons and parties, whether religious or political, that are not in favor of the personal and political freedom and what? Equality of men without regard to race or color. For we believe that aristocracy and despotism is the same all over the world, and that any man or party that would enslave or disenfranchise the Negro would, if it were in his power, as willingly enslave or disenfranchise an Italian, a German, an Irishman, or any other race. They frame, as the 14th Amendment is being ratified, the equality of black people as the centerpiece, the crown jewel, if I may quote Sister Professor Eiffel, of equality and the constitutional integrity of the United States. If we go on, we will see that Charles Langston bequeaths from sire to son that legacy into one of the most important cultural workers, right, of the United States, Langston Hughes, his grandchild. So we see a legacy and a genealogy not only of political activism, but of cultural activism that will be part of the DNA of this center. And if we go on, we will also see the grandfather of W.E.B. Du Bois sitting in 47 at the National Convention, no doubt humbled, as he sits next to the Shads, not in this one, I think it's William, I can't see that, go back, thank you so much. Sitting next to William Wells Brown, the first novelist, black novelist of the United States. Sitting next to, you're gonna have to give me the names there, McCune Smith, one of the early doctors, sitting next to Douglas. Othello Burghardt must have been looking around going, what have I gotten myself into, right? But there is his grandson, right, carrying on that legacy as well. I want us to think about what it means after I read this last quote from the 1883 convention that Douglas is the president of in Louisville. He says, the voice of the whole people oppressed by a common injustice is far more likely to command attention and exert an influence on the public mind than the voice of single individuals and isolated organizations. So what do we learn? We'll just go to the next. What do we learn? We learn from this 70 years of activism that collective action and collective organizing is more important than our individual voices, that it carries more power, more force, more protection, that the heterogeneity of our people is always present when we look at our records, but the uniformity of our orientation toward justice, our commitment to freedom and equality is unified, and that we can have different tactics and different strategies and stand firm in that belief, in that commitment. We know that the struggle against irresponsible power, to quote Frederick Douglass, is a long-distance race. That the smartest minds of the 19th century, the lions of activism, mostly men, and we will hear in a minute from Dr. Jones also about the women who were involved not only in the convention movement, but in the commitment to democracy that is necessary for us to be full and equal people here. That voice, that long-distance race is seriously important together, because they will erase our gains and people will find them again and build on what we build. Again, I'm going to end with this quote: "The voice of the whole people oppressed by a common injustice is far more likely to command attention and exert an influence on the public mind than the voice of single individuals and isolated organizations." And that's precisely why we celebrate the founding of this center at this inaugural symposium today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't think you can hear me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So listen, couple things. First of all, if you want to know more, you want the Colored Conventions movement, you want to get this book and learn you something. It's very important. And we're going to hear next from Martha Jones. We are going to have to tighten up our time. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We're going to tighten it up, so we're going to try to get you to maybe 5, because I do want us to be able to talk together. So maybe 5 to 7 if you can do it, and you can bring out the other things in the course of our conversation. So we'll just keep it moving. Thank you all so much, and thank you for that, Dr. Foreman. That was extraordinary.
It is always an honor to follow my sister Gabrielle Foreman, and I want to thank Sherilyn Eiffel, who I think 20 years ago came to the Midwest as I was trying to build my own little center on race and law at the University of Michigan and did a keynote. What an extraordinary vision you have here, what an extraordinary space you've created for all of us. But I'm especially honored to be here and pay back some of what, just a small bit of what, all that you've done for me and for so many of us. My word today is one word: Black women. I want to tell a story about the before, the during, and the after of the 14th Amendment, with Black women at the center. Because it turns out, in order to have a 14th Amendment, we need vision, we need ideas, we need action, and then in the wake of those words printed on the page, we need individuals who are willing, who are capable, who are courageous enough to show us how to breathe life into them. Citizenship, equal protection, due process, these are ideas. But I'm here to share with us how Black women like Mariah Stewart in the 1820s is already speaking to Americans and breathing these principles into the abolitionist movement, of which she was, I was going to say a part, but I want to say she was a disruptor. Right? Because what Mariah Stewart had to say was that there is no abolitionist movement. There is no movement for the end of slavery if Black women are not at the table, not at the podium, not having a word about what these great principles will come to mean. I want to remind us about the great Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Mary Ann Shadd Cary is a journalist, a woman of the word, a woman of an extraordinarily sharp mind who is going to migrate to Canada, coming out of these conventions that Gabrielle Foreman has shared with us, to put her words on paper, to link together those who live in exile in Canada with those who struggle in the United States. Still, Mary Ann Shadd Cary shows us the way and leaves us her newspaper, The Provincial Freeman, as one of those essential texts for understanding the principles that ultimately animate the 14th Amendment. My love, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. At the podium, the poet, the woman who goes from the quiet work of reflection and wordcraft to the anti-slavery circuit, courageous beyond courageous in the dangers that face her there, to the suffrage platform by the 1860s, telling us what? Two things. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, but that Black women are going to be the measure of our democracy going forward from that watershed moment that is the Civil War and Reconstruction. When Black women look out to settle out what are the terms of the 14th Amendment, I have to tell you, they are disappointed. Which is to say, there is too much in that moment that has not yet taken full account of their interests, of their concerns, of their long insistence on their place in this democracy. Josephine DeQueer will go to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1872. And Josephine DeQueer will not only insist that she is a citizen of the United States by virtue of the 14th Amendment, Josephine DeQueer will insist that she is a lady entitled to the accommodations extended to all white women in the United States. For DeQueer, it is a birth on a steamship going up the Mississippi, but she knows her sisters like Frances Harper, her sisters like Mariah Stewart, her sisters like Mary Ann Shadd Cary have faced that same indignity on streetcars, on the railways, in carriages. This insistence that citizenship is that, yes, the equality, the due process, the birthright that comes in the 14th Amendment, but it is also the dignity that Black women will insert into this conversation. We will talk more about them, but I want to just end with three, what for me are principal insights that come from these women. The first is that they are present. They show up, and they show up in the face of everything that tells them there is no place for them at the table of American democracy. And we must show up. They speak truth to power. With the pen at the podium at every turn, these are women who use poetry, who use sharp words, who use the power of persuasion to not only make their way to that table, but to transform it into one that recognizes them. And finally, they are extraordinarily nimble. These are women who know how to move, right, from the quiet, elegant work of poetry to the fierce charge of standing at the podium before crowds. These are women who know how to move from the challenges of anti-slavery to the insistence on women's suffrage and more. And their nimbleness, I think, is a model for our very time. We must not stand in our prescribed roles. I must not remain the professor that I have struggled very hard to become. I must learn how to move in these times to do the work that is in front of us. So I offer you up that one word, Black women. Thank you all so much.
Kate Masur. And again, if you want to hear more, learn more, Martha Jones' book, Birthright Citizens, has been out for some time. She has a new book out called, Martha Jones, called
The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. Please, wherever books are sold.
Now we'll hear from Professor Kate Masur.
Thank you so much, and I just want to echo my thanks to Sherilyn Ifill and all the organizers for this conference, and I am so very honored to be here and to be with you all today, and to try to follow in the incredible, amazing, and inspiring footsteps of my colleagues, Gabrielle Foreman and Martha Jones. I'm going to talk a little bit now in a short, hopefully, amount of time about how I see some of the origins of the 14th Amendment in a Black-led civil rights movement in the antebellum North, and how the arguments made by that movement shaped the generation of elite white politicians in the Republican Party, the very people who, in the House and the Senate, forged the words of the 14th Amendment and framed out that amendment and brought it before the American people. So those elite men, we might think of Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner or John Bingham, they were significantly influenced by a Black-led social movement for racial equality that took shape and grew in strength in the North in the decades before the war. This movement publicly demanded racial equality, and particularly since Black men were not allowed to vote in most of the northern states before the Civil War, participants in that movement found ingenious ways for pressing their aims, for pressing for equality, for pressing for many of the goals that Professor Foreman mentioned earlier, for education, for better jobs, for better access to all of the things that white Americans already enjoyed. And they did this at every level. They were strategic. They did it at the local, the state, and the federal level. So we're talking about popular mobilizations and coalition building before the Civil War that helped produce the 14th Amendment. I want to talk about how these activists were, in Sherilyn Ifill's words from last night and today, the founders and framers of the amendment. I'm going to talk now about one of those episodes, just one of many, many episodes we could cite, of how these founders and framers at the popular level gave us the vocabulary and the strategies that later worked their way into the amendment and should be on our minds today. I'm going to name some of those early founders and framers, all of whom I'm going to happen to name today are men, so I'm doubly glad that Martha Jones gave us some of the women who were involved in that movement. And part of the reason that the people I'm naming are men here is because they're the ones who come out most clearly in the political conventions that Gabrielle Foreman's project has looked at. And the project, by the way, I just have to say, the Colored Conventions Project has done an amazing job of bringing forward the women who were connected to that movement as well, and kind of has modeled for us how to find women, Black women particularly, in archives where men are so much more visible. So Ohio, the state of Ohio, was at the center of this movement for Black rights before the Civil War. Ohio had these black laws. I don't know if people are familiar with the black laws of Ohio, but Ohio was a free state, and yet it had all of these laws that said that African Americans couldn't settle there legally, had to provide free papers if they wanted to settle, could not testify in court cases involving white people, that their children were not provided for public education, and that by the state constitution, the vote was for white men only. It's well known in a small corner of the world that in 1849, the Ohio legislature repealed most of those laws, and the story associated with it is of two independent-minded white Ohio legislators who working with Salmon Chase, who later became a Lincoln administration official and the Supreme Court Chief Justice, working with Salmon Chase kind of worked these political machinations in the Ohio State House to get most of the black laws repealed. The story has so often been told focusing on that moment in the Ohio legislature, but the reality is that that moment only came to pass because of a broad-based social movement that unfolded over many decades before that. As early as the 1810s in Ohio, African Americans were speaking out against the black laws of Ohio, arguing that the kind of inequality that African Americans experienced in Ohio was un-American, contradicted the Bible, and should no longer exist. Black activists built alliances with white allies, and the aim, of course, in state politics was to persuade enough voters to change the people who they would elected, and so the laws would be repealed. This was a long-term project. Over time, this movement adapted to changing political conditions. Often, black and white people organized in parallel organizations. Many times, or actually for the most part, this was not a super interracial movement, although people were working together toward the same goals and were in conversation with each other. So to give you an example, and this is on Professor Foreman's amazing Colored Conventions website, African Americans in Ohio organized their first statewide convention that we're aware of in 1837. That statewide convention occurs in Columbus, Ohio, and highest on their list of things to do is petition the state legislature for repeal of the black laws. They argue that racial distinctions were not, quote, found in justice or equality. They promise to keep fighting until they reach their goal. These activists, these African American Ohioans, faced horrible conditions at times. There was a brutal anti-black riot in Cincinnati in 1841. A black boy who experienced that riot was a person named John Mercer Langston. He was in Cincinnati at the time, and he later recalled that he was terrified. And yet, he wrote, the event was also in some ways a positive turning point. It bolstered the confidence of black activists and their white allies. After the riot, John Mercer Langston wrote, black orators and writers increasingly found their footing as, quote, fearless and able defenders of their people. White and black organizing in Ohio continued into the 1840s. In 1843, a black man named David Jenkins and others in Columbus founded a newspaper, the Palladium of Liberty. The masthead said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created free and equal. Again, demanding equality, using that language from the Declaration of Independence and trying to bring it into the laws and the constitutions of the United States. At the opening, at the same time, white politicians are reporting that white Ohioans are increasingly amenable to the idea of repealing the black laws. Finally, after the election of 1848, it looks like it actually might happen. At the opening of that legislative session in January of 1849, who is holding a convention? Black Ohioans are holding a convention. One night, they speak in the House of Representatives. They hold their convention in the House of Representatives of the state of Ohio. Among the speakers are a man named John Watson, a black barber who had migrated to Ohio from Virginia, and William Howard Day, a black Oberlin student who was born free in New York. They declared, with respect to the black laws, quote, it is true, stripped as we are of political power, we have only moral power over those laws, but it is only necessary to wield this power aright, and it is mighty to the pulling down of the strongholds of oppression and wrong. And it was in that legislative session that the majority of the black laws were finally repealed, and this was a victory that stood the test of time. There were efforts to bring them back, and Ohio perpetually stopped that from happening, and those black laws and laws of that kind were then rendered unconstitutional by the 14th Amendment. So because the 3 is the magic number, I want to just briefly draw 3 potential conclusions from this kind of movement and the way that this popular movement made its way into politics in the state of Ohio, and these ideas made their way into our Constitution. First, this is part of the history of everyday people advancing ideas through political action. And here I think it's especially important to think about how they used the language of equality from the Declaration of Independence and also from the Bible and also from science to demand racial equality in particular. The term equal was never in the Constitution until the 14th Amendment. This movement put that term equal and equality on the map and taught the people who would later become the elite white framers of the 14th Amendment how important it was. Second, involvement in movements and talking outward about politics helps people learn. It helps people build political experience and connections. from this movement, John Mercer Langston, a boy in Cincinnati in 1841, went on to become, as Professor Foreman said earlier, the founding dean of Howard Law School. He served before that as the president of a Black-led organization called the National Equal Rights League, which was founded at a Black convention in 1864. He became a US congressman. He had an illustrious career. His experiences in Ohio shaped who he became. And finally, a lesson about contingency and unexpectedness over time. The statewide Black Convention of 1837 was not the beginning of this movement, but it was an important landmark. It was 12 more years to 1849 when the Black laws were repealed. It was 19 more years until the 14th Amendment was ratified. In the middle of all of that have been a civil war that no one could have predicted, 20 years earlier. And so we never know what the outcomes will be when we take action now. And as Professor Eiffel said earlier, nothing is wasted. We can't know the impact of what we're doing today in the future, how it will inspire people, how defeats may be short-term, but victories may come over the longer term. And so I think that, too, is another important lesson from this movement. So with that, thank you.
We needed that today. And if you want to read more of Professor Masur's work, her monumental text, Until Justice Be Done, and I think the after the colon is the first civil rights movement, is that what it's called? The first civil rights movement, Until Justice Be Done. This is all before the 14th Amendment. And now she has a new graphic book out as well, Freedom Was in Sight, A Graphic History of Reconstruction. Get yourself these important texts. We're gonna hear next from Reverend William Lamar. That's Reverend Lamar to me. And many of you may not know that as pastor of Metropolitan AME Church, Reverend Lamar has been the driving force in that church now owning the trademark for the Proud Boys after engaging in litigation. And I know he's going to tell us a little bit about that, but I see him getting ready like a pastor before a sermon. Right. And so I want to just say this. We do need a word, but the word is a sermonette. It's a sermonette. It's a sermonette. Okay.
There is no need to fear, no need to fear. Just want to say that I studied rhetoric with Frank Thomas, and one of the canons of African rhetoric that does not show up in European rhetoric is that of silence. And that is that the human cannot speak worthy words unless she live in silence and hear what silence teaches, and one ought not speak unless one can improve upon what has been said. And I want to honor what our colleagues have said, our sisters have said this morning, to thank them for their scholarship and commitment to building brick by brick, word by word, page by page, a new world. Let me also acknowledge ancestrally the fact that we are on holy ground. We want to honor those names that have been spoken: Pauli Murray, Dovey Roundtree, Charles Hamilton, Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and to note that the intellectual and legal infrastructure upon which that next civil rights movement was built, much of it happened in this place. And we cannot forget that, because what is necessary for what is next must also emerge from places such as this. I just spent a couple of days with my hero, Jeremiah Alvesta Wright Jr. Just came back from Chicago. I was in his home for 2 days. And he inspired me as a young preacher because he said what others would not say. He stood up to the conservatism of our institution. And I want to quote from Alan Aubrey Buzak's book, Selfless Revolutionaries, Biko, Black Consciousness, Black Theology, and a Global Ethic of Solidarity and Resistance, by way of confession, and move very briefly into what we are doing. In these pages, we will grapple with what Biko called that first truth, bitter as it may seem, that black preachers have connived at keeping Christianity the ideal religion for the maintenance of the subjugation of our people. I want to say that because it remains true that precious few of us have leveraged our tradition, the black prophetic tradition, the only Christian expression in the imperial United States that has always welcomed all human beings. The National Cathedral is just a stone's throw away from here. At its inception and building, it did not welcome all people. Our church is 187 years old and has never excluded any human being. We must ask ourselves what has infected the morality of those persons and their progeny that even today they work to build a world of exclusion. And so when these workers of iniquity knocked on the door of Metropolitan, they did not realize they knocked on the door of the wrong black church. They had the wrong black pastor who had been reading books for years about how our people have never bent nor bowed. And when they came and they violated our space and tore down our sign, when I got a call from the Washington Committee, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and from others asking if we would sue, we said yes. And we said yes in the spirit of Beulah Donald, whose son was murdered by the Klan, and who sued the Klan and later owned the property of the Klan. We sued in the spirit of Mumbet, Elizabeth Freeman, who sued for her freedom and the freedom of others in the 1700s. We stood because we knew that if we did not stand, it would further embolden them. And we stood not just for ourselves, but we understand that if we cannot gather in peace, then the freedom of all is ultimately compromised. And so we sued the first time and won a $2.8 million judgment. They refused to pay. And so we sued for what they owned of value, which is their trademark. And now we own their trademark, and we are profiting from what they used for evil. And so I will finally say this, that I am as clear as one can be in the moment after reading a lot and watching an excellent documentary about Walter White, if you've not watched it on PBS. The work that Walter White and the NAACP was doing that we have discussed, that is the progeny of the colored conventions, at its time, it was innovative. We have lived with it for so long now that it seems stale. But at its time, it was innovative. I am clear that whatever we need institutionally does not yet exist.
That's right.
Because we are now seeking relief from institutions that they are dismantling. Seeking to dismantle. And even if they do not fully dismantle them, these institutions will not be the same after these moments that they are now.
That's absolutely right.
They will never return to what we considered normal.
That's right.
And so what is next will demand all of these extraordinary Howard Law students I met on the way in, will demand all of our collective expertise, because we must be midwives in the labor room of freedom and democracy. Thank you all. And look, I was trying not to be a preacher, but they were here talking about push. I'll stay over.
Thank you so much, Reverend Lamar. We're now going to hear from Latosha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. That was a word we needed for sure. Can't go back. Can't go back.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me, over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
wanted to start in that way because I'm really full. I'm trying to keep myself together because I'm mad as hell. I'm angry and I'm heartbroken. Yeah. And I'm disappointed. I'm even disappointed, you know, in people who I know who are allies, who were supposed to be standing in this space. And so, you know, as I was sitting there praying, I was like, God, let me get it together. Let me get it together, right? Because I wanted to come up here and give you the perfect kind of thoughts and respondents, right? Y'all, shit is real. And I'm saying that because a number of years, those of us who have been screaming, y'all, the house is on fire. The house is on fire, right? We're actually feeling the intensity of the fire right now. We're in it. You know, we are in this space. Not, oh, will fascism happen? It's here. Not will authoritarianism happen? It's here. Not with every single right that we've actually fought to get in this country is under attack. It is here. And so what I want to say it with the 14th Amendment, but there's something I need to say with you all as well. You know, I want us to also recognize that in this moment, we actually helped co-create this moment. We did. It's great for us to talk about the Republicans and those what I call the anti-humans, because they're anti-human people, right? Or he who, I don't even want to say his name right now, and that whole crew. But the truth of the matter is every time we did not stand for the 14th Amendment, every time we stepped over those who were homeless, every time we allowed other people outside of our communities to be marginalized, we actually opened up the pathway for this moment right now. And I'm saying that because it's easier for us to see, right, what others don't do or what they do. But ultimately, what I know for sure, and this supports it, what I'm responding to today, is that if we are to have the America that we desire, we deserve, we will have to create it. That we are the visionaries. I've moved everywhere I go across this country. When I talk to young people, I say, move from seeing yourselves as citizens of this nation and start thinking you are founders of a new nation yet unborn. A nation that every single citizen, every single person in this country receives dignity and respect. And so I'm going to ask you all to do something for me real quick, and I know I only have a minute. I'm going to wrap it up. I want you to close your eyes. I do this everywhere I go. Close your eyes and get kind of grounded. Get grounded in your seat. And I want to ask you some questions. My first question to you is, what would America look like without racism? What would healthcare look like? What would education look like? What would a workday look like? What would the financial system look like? What would America look like without racism? The second question is, what would this nation look like if all human beings felt valued and respected? I didn't say you gotta like them. Just if all human beings felt valued and respected. Now open your eyes. How many of y'all in this room have been asked that question before? In a room full, 2 hands. Now, let me ask you this question. Someone name one thing that is in existence that wasn't first envisioned. There is nothing that has ever existed that was not first envisioned. These speakers, this podium, the dress I have on, everything that has manifested itself in the physical realm first had to be envisioned. If we are not envisioning a nation without racism, that means that we are conceding. Racism is not my birthright.
That's right.
It is not our birthright. So if it is not, then we have to radically reimagine every single system in this country. We have to radically reimagine this nation itself so that we create a society that says that all God's children have value, that we create a society that equity is real. And so, yes, there is the feeling part and what I wanted to say and share with you all just quickly as I get ready to go to my seat. That it's interesting. One of the things that I know, I feel like when I'm in spaces like this, I'm always thankful to God. I'm like, I'm in spaces. God, what is it for you? What is it that you want me to say? And so I had prepared, I did all this research and had prepared this speech. That's not how Spirit has moved me in this moment. But what I will say is I came here today to even get confirmation. You may not see us in the streets, right? Oh, but we are working. And you don't see us in the streets because we see what's at play. Like, we see that he's doing everything he can to bait us. He wants to bait us. He wants to call martial law. Then all of a sudden suspend elections, suspend everything. We're clear. We're way more sophisticated. Way more sophisticated than some think we are in terms of organizing. But believe you me, we will organize. There will be a 14th Amendment or there will not be an America. Have it whatever way you want it. But we shall not continue to build a nation that is still wet with the blood of our ancestors, and we're going to have an argument about whether we are citizens? Yes. Oh, no, we done that. We ain't marching no across no more bridges. It's what do you want? Do you want this nation or you want something else? Because you will not have this nation and not have the 14th Amendment. We will guarantee you that. I'll say this, there are state conventions being had everywhere. There are organizations working right now that those of you that are interested in being part of a colored convention that we're organizing, the State of the People, we did a 24 hours, there was an incident where a beloved journalist, Joanne Reed, was fired from MSNBC. And so many of us came together and had a 24-hour media blitz where we literally for 24 hours, we said, turn off the TVs and listen to us. And so that has grown. And so we've got a 10-city tour that is happening, that's starting next month, that we're going all over this nation. We're going to continue to meet. We're going to continue to meet, and it's not going to take us 38 years. So thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you so much, Latosha, and that's so important for people to understand that things are happening. You need to get connected. Things are happening. And that 24 hours, that was over the 24 hours of the State of the Union. It came together in about 2 days.
State of the People.
State of the People. Well, it was during what is called the State of the Union. And it was created and called the State of the People. It was on Roland Martin's YouTube channel. And it featured amazing activists, lawyers, organizational leaders, 24 hours. And actually, I think Roland has told us that they have done all the crunching of the numbers, and it came in number 5 among programs that were watched over the State of the Union. Wow. So it was powerful. And so you got to actually get plugged in to understand that things are happening. But the point of this, and that beautifully kind of circles this whole panel, is to understand that even though we are in a law school and we think very highly of lawyers doing important and good work, and I believe in it, and I've been a civil rights lawyer for 35 years, our contributions are important. The contributions of legislatures are important, sitting in those rooms. But the ideas, the vision is being incubated by ordinary people organizing over time, and we are inheritors of what they are incubating. We may be able to turn it into the proper legislative language, but the ideas are being incubated by ordinary people. And therefore, it's important for ordinary people to understand that you are founders and framers. You are not observers.
That's right.
You are not observers, and democracy is not happening to you. You are, by what you do, participants in the transformation of democracy. And that means that it is not enough, if there's one thing I know, and I'm writing this in my book, the citizenship that we have been told is the critical citizenship is not enough anymore. It's not enough to just vote.
That's right.
And I hope we've learned that. It's not enough to just vote. I'm not saying obviously, black voters matter. We got to vote, for sure. But it's not enough.
No, it's not.
It's not enough.
No.
And so that means you have to get plugged in. You have to get plugged into something else.
That's right.
So let's kind of see, how much time do we have? Who's keeping the time? Fantastic. Okay. So what I really wanted to then talk about was to tie this together. This extraordinary history that we've heard of what was happening 20, 30, 40, 50 years before the end of the Civil War, before the drafting of the amendment happened, and we're hearing people use this language of equality, and to think about how extraordinary that is, because again, reminding you, it does not appear in the first Constitution, right? So people are shaping a concept, right, that they're pulling from the Declaration of Independence, that they believe for their lives. It doesn't have to exist for you to work with that concept, right? The idea is to envision this concept. So I want to talk about the pathway from organizing to realization. You know, we've had some experiences of it. You know, we experienced it in the civil rights movement, where there was activism that translated then, and to be clear, the activism the activists were not clear from day one
That's right.
what the outcome was going to be. Because I have people say to me all the time, but where's the strategy? In the civil rights movement, we got the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I mean, you know what the strategy of the Montgomery bus boycott was? Excuse me? To be desegregated on the Montgomery buses, right? It was not to end segregation in America, right? It was not to end segregation, you know, in every state in the nation. It was to end segregation on the buses in Montgomery. And what we have to understand is that once you get in it, right, your brain starts opening and expanding the ideas of what is possible. So I want to talk, if each of you could just touch on that a little bit, the idea of what happens from organizing to realization, and whether there are lessons that we should be getting from that in this moment, because we're not doing a lot of realizing right along through here, right? So I think people need to be encouraged to understand what that pathway looks like. Sometimes that pathway is going to be 60 years. Sometimes that pathway is going to be 100 years. But sometimes that pathway, we think about the civil rights movement, if we want to start it in 1954 when Brown was decided, and it ends in 1968 when King is assassinated and we have the last big civil rights statute, the Fair Housing Act. That's what, how many years? 14 years. 14 years. So it can be very short as well. So I wondered if you each might touch on that. I'm going to start on the end with Dr. Foreman, and then we'll just continue on about like that, what you've learned about what that pathway looks like.
I want to thank you for those comments, because it is early on, even though it's also late in the day.
Yeah.
It's both. And there were 176 conventions between 68, so when the 14th Amendment passes, and 77, when we start to get turned back. But 65 of them were in those 2 years when the 14th Amendment was being considered. So, and they were all over, from Alabama to, I was going to say Alaska because I like alliteration, but that would just be a lie. Maryland to Georgia, Iowa, D.C., Kentucky to Kansas, Alabama, Texas to New York to North Carolina. So all over the country, that kind of organizing was taking place. So this kind of idea about convening, about opening ourselves up to next steps, to doing so with trusted thinkers, reasoned people, being careful about who might be infiltrating, right? Being trusting that our moral and political values are going to be guiding, to not turn on each other because our tactics are different, right? And to keep our eyes on the prize, right? Seems really important in this moment. I want to thank the Reverend, too, because we need to do this in churches. We need to do this in communities. We need to stand tall. The other thing I think that is important about the convention movement that tells us something that you have also underscored, Professor Eiffel, and then I will end, is that although there was a network of activists whose name we all know, the Lions of the 19th century, who included both Frances Harper at the conventions and Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who I need to say was the first Black woman to go to law school in North America. And where did she enroll? That's right, right here, right? And her roommate, Charlotte Ray, was the daughter, the first Black woman to graduate, right? And was the daughter of an editor who was also a newspaper editor. Those institutions, right, revitalizing Black newspapers so they are political, not social newspapers, that they are revitalizing churches so that they are standing and organizing in ways that protect our rights, and our souls and our spirits and our communities and our housing and the freedom of our bodies from violence, right, from state-sanctioned violence is really critical. So we will find our way if we are committed to the path. And that commitment is the thing I think that is most important.
I'd like to introduce, though I think she needs no introduction, the great Mary McLeod Bethune. You know, Mrs. Bethune begins her life, the last child of 11 in South Carolina, and she has a vision. It takes her to Daytona, Florida, where she's an educator, an institution builder. But before long, she is organizing for what? Women's votes.
That's right.
She's traveling the hard and dangerous road, which is the state of Florida, excuse me, in 1920, encouraging black women to register, to organize, to come to the polls. You all know the story. On the eve of Election Day in 1920, the Ku Klux Klan in Daytona organizes a rally and a march, and their purpose is to visit Mrs. Bethune's school. And they do indeed march on the grounds of her school to intimidate Mrs. Bethune, her faculty, her girls. Black women vote in Daytona, but the violence rages. They vote again the next year. The violence only increases. And Mrs. Bethune has to pivot. She has to pivot. She makes her way to Washington, D.C., a city in which, in those days, while a black woman certainly couldn't be elected to Congress, she could show up and find her way into the halls of power. And you all know the story of Mrs. Bethune, who becomes part of the kitchen cabinet at the White House, who begins to bring black women and black men to Washington, not because they've won at the polls, but because Mrs. Bethune has made a place in the burgeoning federal agencies that are part of Roosevelt's plan to bring the nation out of the Depression. Mrs. Bethune lives a long life, long enough to see the founding of the United Nations. And I think this is where we see not only the ambition, but the necessity of a vision that is about this nation, but it's frankly about a great deal more. It is about the globe. And Mrs. Bethune wants a place at the table at the founding of the United Nations. She wants to make sure that black women's questions are on the agenda in that institution from the beginning. Now, y'all know the men in that delegation do not want Mrs. Bethune to join them, but she does. And now she's a part of a world of women, women of color from across the globe indeed, who are talking not only about the rights in 14th Amendment terms, but in human right terms. So I offer up Mrs. Bethune today, who sits her likeness in the Capitol, standing there in marble, holding a place for us in that institution from which we have been so alienated in these months and in these years, holding a place for us, but also reminding us about the long vision and our calling to do the work in whatever guise we are called upon to do the work. And so I thank you all for the opportunity to say her name.
Thank you. Thank you. Kate.
I think I'll just talk a little bit about media. And this was kind of inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott mention, and it began with just trying to ride the bus and turned into a movement that inspired people all over the country and reached even beyond the borders of the country. And I think, media, we talk a lot about this. I mean, the modes of media have changed a lot, technology changes, and I was really surprised to find for the decades before the Civil War how much media was a factor. So you have, for example, the drive of black activists to found black newspapers, to be able to tell black stories. Those newspapers were very political, but they also did cover social relationships and people visiting one another and talk about how to raise our children. And so they were these very well-rounded kind of institutions that were very deliberately created to describe the views and advance the views of Black Americans for their own communities, and to a lesser extent, I think, to white audiences. But I guess larger point I want to make here is, when I said that the repeal of the Ohio Black laws was a big deal, 4 years later, in 1853, the state of Illinois, which had very similar laws, went in the opposite direction. They passed a new anti-Black law that was far worse than any before. They tried to bar Black migration into the state completely. And it was one of those events where it turned out that a lot of white Illinoisans, including some pretty conservative people, didn't really want to enforce that law. And the media, including the kind of more progressive white media in Illinois, said, you know, this is the shame of our nation. We are ashamed before our sister states. Look at Ohio. They did better than we did. We are embarrassed before the entire country. And so in my estimation, that Illinois Black law, as it was called, actually completely backfired, because it drew so much, because the media, including the Black and white media, drew so much attention to how absurd, how extreme, how racist, how un-American, how anti-citizenship this law was. And so, you know, I think on the question of how movements move from the local to a more national, how ideas travel, how things get known, how people begin to be inspired and emulate what's going on one place and take it to another place. Media is often the way that happens, and that suggests things to think about for now in terms of how when we take action, when we do things, that having other people know about it, right? Speaking through the media to other people, that's an important kind of institution that is indeed like a mediator, right, between movements and politics, and that's something to consider.
So before we get to our last two, thank you so much, Professor Masur. Two observations, and then I think we're going to let Reverend Lamar and Latosha Brown have the last word and close us out. Two things. One is, for lawyers, this is true for you as, oh, okay, cool. This is true for you as well. If you think about from the beginning of the Thurgood Marshall's first successful civil rights case, which he filed and won in municipal court in Baltimore in 1935, challenging the exclusion of Black people from the University of Maryland School of Law. That's 35 to Brown versus Board of Education in 54. That's not even 20 years. And they were not imagining from the 35 case that they were going to be able to do what they did in Brown. Mm-hmm. The other piece is to remember that as they began to move towards this idea of breaking the back of Jim Crow and ending segregation, they were doing two things at the same time. Because I hear people all the time get very nostalgic about this period and say, but we had Black schools and that may have been better than us having integrated schools. A lot of what Thurgood Marshall was doing during that period were teacher pay cases, some of which he won, many of which he lost. That is, the schools were never separate and equal, and never would be separate and equal, not only because Southern jurisdictions did not want to fund Black schools at an equal level, but because they actually did not have the capacity, did not have the resources to run two concurrent school districts. And so during that period, remember, Thurgood Marshall's mother was a teacher, and he understood that teacher pay was important because it meant money in the pockets of Black teachers. It meant money coming into Black families. And that was critically important during that pendency period. He had some successes with that. And we should just remember, you can do two things at once, right? You can have your ultimate goal, and you can also recognize that you have to respond to the needs that exist in the moment for your community. And that's a critical part of the work as well for both organizing and for lawyers. And then finally, I wanted to say just about the organizing work, that you have to leave room for unintended consequences. I was writing about this this week as we see various law firms being pressured in this moment, and a number of them capitulating to that pressure and others not. And I was reminding people of what Black lawyers went through during the civil rights movement, and people have conveniently forgotten this period in which the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in particular was really attacked by Southern jurisdictions, Texas, Florida, Alabama, all over the South, Mississippi, accusing the lawyers of engaging in improper solicitation of clients and not registering as a foreign agent and all of this other stuff. And that in fact, LDF was kept out of practicing in Alabama.
That's right.
for 6 years. Not just LDF, but the NAACP was kept out of, now, we don't think about it because we think about all the successes that happened in Alabama, but we're not remembering that they did attack the lawyers and that they were successful, and at least for 6 years during the pendency of the litigation, while they were trying to get the membership lists of the NAACP, they were successful in keeping the lawyers and the NAACP out of Alabama. And in other instances during the pendency of litigation, it was for a few months in Mississippi or Florida or what have you. What's interesting about Alabama is that because the NAACP could not do their organizing work, they couldn't raise money in Alabama, people were now afraid to be associated with them, their membership dropped precipitously. 2 other civil rights organizations came into being and came to have prominence during that period. One was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which Dr. Martin Luther King was the head, and the other was SNCC. So that is to say that even in moments when we are pushed back,
That's right.
right, we have to be, the great Charles Sherrod, great civil rights activist, said very early on when I first met him when I was in law school that racism is a shapeshifter.
Yep.
And my sister is here. We grew up watching horror movies and you know, werewolves and vampires and that kind of stuff. And if you remember from those movies, there were always people who, whatever the guise of the shapeshifter, would know that was the word. Even when he didn't look like a wolf, right? They would know because they had some kind of special, they saw a pentagram, whatever the thing was, right? So I always liken that to me as a civil rights lawyer, that if racism is a shapeshifter, my job is to see it in whatever guise it presents itself, right? And I think we have to be shapeshifters too. And so when they put the NAACP out of Alabama, these other organizations that became core, right? There could be no the successes of the civil rights movement without SCLC and without SNCC. That's what happened as a result of that oppression. So I also think it's important for us to remember, and we're going to need to remember it in these times as we feel this pressure. We're not going anywhere, right? We may not look like we looked, but we're not going anywhere, and we're going to keep shape-shifting so that we can do the work, and we have to hold on to that belief. I want to close with Latosha Brown and with Reverend Lamar, and as you bring your answer to the last question, I want you to really talk about areas of strength that you think we should be more readily utilizing. What are some of the areas of strength that, because we like to talk about our deficiencies all the time and our weaknesses, I want to talk about what are the areas of strength that you have identified in your work that we should be using more readily, more passionately, more intensely, particularly in times of tremendous pressure. We can start with you, Reverend Lamar, if you wish.
Sure. Again, I'm deeply honored to be here and thankful for the conversation. So first, I'm talking about this because I spent a lot of time thinking and writing about it. We must, in this moment, revivify, resurrect, and give prominence to our ancestors. Because if we do not, we will miss the energy they offer us to get through this moment successfully and to maintain an even more robust humanity through it. So I've written something that's coming out. This is let me try to give it to us visually. Washington, D.C., as the capital of the American Empire, is a case study in ancestral veneration. Every street and monument venerates those who used violence and strategy to conquer land and people. And they do not get a pass for their inhumanity by framing them as people of their time. Oh, Washington and Jefferson people. No, they chose to be treacherous and inhumane because there were other ways they could have organized the nation state. There were other ways they could have found labor, but they chose a way that was inhuman that we are still working through. What I'm saying is we must prioritize and call the names of ancestors like Mary McLeod Bethune, and not just know their names. As KRS One says, you can't know Black history just as facts and figures, but you got to know the stories. You got to know the texture of their humanity. And Ernest Green is a member of our congregation, and I once asked him, Dr. Carr, how did you all get to this place? And he said, in history class. Oh, if you all, thank you. I'm old. I'm assuming the rest of y'all are old too. Ernest Green was one of the Little Rock Nine who helped to integrate the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I once asked him, how did you all get the power to do that work? He said he sat in history class and the teacher taught them about the maroon community of Africans. And he said that when he heard the story of the maroon community, it stiffened his spine and made him know that he could wade into waters that might lead to freedom. So we've got to tell more full-orbed stories about what we have gone through. And what they're trying to do in erasing history is to keep us away from those stories, while at the same time amplifying stories that are historically inaccurate and that are based upon people who built inhumane systems that continue to rob us of life and liberty. Second, I see vitality amongst young people. Here's the problem, especially, again, I'm in the church and I love the institution, but I critique it as well. We want young people as window dressing. So we do not want to hear their critique. I have young people that are coming now who practice not only Christianity, but candomblé and hoodoo. And I'm like, do it all. I'm like, do all the things that set us free, because any faith is not pure. All faiths borrow from faith. And I can name the stuff that my grandparents did. It wasn't in the Bible. It was African survivals. They found ways to tune in. So young people are asking questions, pushing the boundaries. I find hope there. And finally, we must radicalize and revolutionize our institutions. Many of us are afraid. I'm 50 years old. I know people who have placed ladders against, I see you women, I'm almost done. They place ladders against buildings and they climb in the interest of career, only to wake up at my age to determine that the ladder was leaning up against the wrong building. Lean your ladder up against the house of freedom and liberation. And when you wake up, you will not look down wishing your ladder was leaned up against another structure.
Come on.
So I will say that part of this work, I know a little bit about Alabama since I'm a girl from a place called Selma, Alabama. You know, in this moment, I think we really have to shift the paradigm of how we're seeing ourselves. And I don't think for the sake of saving the country, I think it has to be for the sake of saving people. That even though my adult life, all of my work has been dedicated towards getting people politically engaged, but our politics are not going to save us. It will be our humanity. And so our politics have to be in service of the advancement of humanity. And so what I think in this moment, there is a unique opportunity in this moment that there is a very hard, dark moment. What I'm noticing is very similar. It's interesting. I feel affirmed in some ways, because sometimes the things that you're doing, you don't know, I don't know if I know what I'm doing, right? And so even some of the history that I know, I realized I stored it somewhere back in my head and didn't pull it forward. But what I am seeing is similar, almost exactly what you all have raised. Those things are happening right now, where there are national conventions being had, where there are gatherings of organizations, many organizations that got beef with each other, have differences with each other, are coming together in different and interesting kind of ways. You know, I think that there are three pieces, I'll say from, one, let me also, I forgot to welcome y'all to the South. Because the Mason-Dixon line really is in Canada right now, right? You will see elements of that. That is what has been being put in place, right? It is the blueprint, right? And there has been a blueprint around how do you resist that. And there's a lot that we can learn from folk in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Florida and those southern states that we've actually, Trump ain't new to us. We deal with Trumps every day. We've been dealing with Trumps. Infrastructure, or building out the ecosystem, and messaging. What is the narrative that we're seeing? Those are the three things, or I think it's been the three-legged stool that's actually impacted us. And so those are the things that we really need to be thinking about investment. One, in terms of money, small donations. That part of the challenge, we said this, we were screaming this last election cycle, that one of the things that you do is when you create and just do hard political money. It's all about the candidate. And so this had to be something greater. We were saying that there was an argument around a larger freedoms that wasn't just tied to a candidate, even though we supported him, Kamala Harris. But the bottom line that it had to be a greater process. And so part of the way that we've done our work is to actually fund organizations on the ground. We've invested over $53 million we've given away to black grassroots groups on the ground to do power building work. That's from everything from reparations to dealing with local ordinances, how they define power, where it is on a self-determination model. The second thing that I think is really important is to support the organizing that is happening in communities. Don't assume that it's not happening because it's not on TV, that there's a lot of incredible good work that's happening. You know organizations that have credibility, that have legacy, that have been around. It is important for you to support those organizations. You would be amazed at how out of all the millions, we've raised $146 million in the last 7 years. And out of all of the money that we've raised, the most important money that I've ever received was on the corner of in Pritchard, Alabama, where a sister went into her truck and came in and she had $12 in change and said, "This is all I got. But I want to give this to y'all because I believe in y'all." I'm saying that because in this moment, that when you are sending those checks and those messages, we read them. They actually make us feel affirmed. And it's really important, not that we know that people stand behind us, not just some foundation or some funder that on a whim that they get scared, they pull out, but it's important for you to send that message. The last and the final thing that I'll say really is around message. That we have to share the story. Just in this story right here, just today, I feel fortified in terms of going back, remembering that, oh, okay, all right, the state conventions, okay, that works, okay, black women, okay, we got that check. National conventions, we got that check. 14th Amendment and the 14th Amendment Center, we got that check. So ultimately, I do think we're in a good position, so thank you.
I just want to make sure that we just properly pause for a second. You said something about silence, because we've heard so much. And just drink it in. This is what we have. These are the resources that we have. To know who we are, to know where we came from, to have the strength we need to carry us forward, to strategize. This is not going anywhere. This is not going anywhere. So I want to thank each of you for your presentations, for your scholarship, for your incredible work, for your passion, for your energy, for your vision, for your determination. This was wonderful, and I wanted to start today like this. So please join me in giving another round of applause to this opening panel.